The moment the three lords drew their blades on her, the grand ballroom fell into a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Della stood frozen on the dais, a simple mender of books in a borrowed silk dress, facing the polished steel tips meant for her heart. They called her a commoner, a stain on his ancient name. He was Lord Valerius, master of the shadow-drenched Blackwood Manor, a being of impossible age and power whom they all feared, and he had just named her his intended bride. But what none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that this quiet woman with ink stains on her fingers was the only person in 1,000 years who had ever truly seen him. If you believe that being seen for who you truly are is the most powerful magic of all, type "I see you" below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know that Della's world had once been very small, smelling of decaying paper and beeswax. She was a restorer of rare texts, not the grand, celebrated work of rebinding spines in gilded leather, but the soul-crushingly precise labor of mending torn vellum and coaxing faded ink back from the ghost of a memory. Her fingers, though often smudged with pigment, were as steady as a surgeon's. Her eyes could distinguish 10 different shades of black, could see the faint impression a quill had left on a page 5 centuries ago. It was a quiet, solitary life, and she had been content with it, until the day she was ruined by a single laugh. She had been commissioned by the prestigious House Thorne to restore a family prayer book. It was a great honor, a step up from the dusty archives of the city library. She had worked for weeks, her heart singing with the effort, bringing the delicate illuminations back to life. On the day she presented it, the young Lord Thorne, a man with a cruel, handsome mouth, had held it up for his friends. He hadn't praised the meticulous work. He had pointed to a faint smudge of graphite on her cuff. He said, with a dismissive sneer, "Can you believe it? The little ink witch thought her grubby hands were worthy of our history." The room had erupted in laughter, cold, aristocratic laughter that flayed her alive. She was dismissed without payment, her reputation in tatters. The story spread. Della, the grubby ink witch, overreaching, uncouth. She retreated back to her small corner of the world, the wound of that humiliation a constant, quiet ache in her chest. She was unseen, or worse, seen only as a joke. Lord Valerius was a name spoken only in whispers. He was the oldest of the old blood, a recluse who resided in an estate of sprawling black stone and perpetual twilight on the edge of the moors. He was a patron of the arts, his donations to the Grand Library legendary, but he never appeared in public. His affairs were handled by a severe, gray-faced solicitor. Some said he was disfigured, others that he was mad. All agreed he was powerful beyond measure. The chill that seemed to cling to his name was more than just rumor. On the rare occasions his carriage passed through the city, street lamps would flicker and die, and horses would shy away for no reason. People would pull their collars tighter, a sudden, inexplicable frost settling in the air. Della knew the stories, but they were as distant to her as fairy tales. He was a lord. She was a mender. Their worlds were not meant to intersect. But fate, like ink, has a way of bleeding through the carefully drawn lines of society. It began with a summons. A carriage blacker than a starless night arrived at her humble lodgings. The driver, a man who did not seem to blink, handed her a letter sealed with a crest she did not recognize, a raven with a key in its beak. The letter was not a request. It was a command. She was to come to Blackwood Manor, immediately. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. But defiance, born of having nothing left to lose, was a flickering candle flame inside it. She packed her finest tools, her bone folders, her agate burnishers, her carefully mixed pigments, and stepped into the silent, velvet-lined carriage. The journey to Blackwood was like entering another world. The sun seemed to dim, the greens of the countryside deepening to moss and shadow. The air grew cold, smelling of pine and damp earth and something else, something ancient, like stone from the deep places of the world. The manor itself did not loom. It commanded. It was a fortress of dark gray stone, sharp angles and towering spires that claw at the bruised twilight sky. No lights shone in the windows. It was a place that seemed to be holding its breath. She was led through halls of chilling silence, her footsteps echoing on marble floors that felt like plates of ice. The air was frigid, her breath pluming in front of her. Candles in iron sconces flickered violently as she passed, though there was no draught. The shadows in the corners of her eyes seemed to shift and pool, gathering and then receding like a slow tide. They brought her to a library. It was the most magnificent room she had ever seen. 2 stories high, walled with books from floor to ceiling, with a great cold fireplace at one end. A man stood before the hearth, his back to her. He was tall, dressed in immaculate black, and his stillness was absolute. It was not the stillness of patience, but of predation, of a statue that might at any moment spring to life. He turned, and Della forgot how to breathe. He was not disfigured. He was beautiful, in a way that was both terrifying and hypnotic. His face was all sharp lines and pale marble, his hair as black as a raven's wing. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a twilight sky, a deep, fathomless gray. And as he looked at her, truly looked at her, she saw them shift, just for a second, to a burning, impossible crimson. "You are the mender," he said. His voice was low, a resonant hum that vibrated in the very bones of the room. It sounded like smoke and old wine and the turning of century-old pages. Della found her own voice, surprised it didn't tremble. "I am. My name is Della." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I am Valerius. I have a task for you." He gestured to a large lectern in the center of the room. On it lay a book. It was ancient, bound in what looked like blackened, cracked leather, its pages the color of old bone. It was in a terrible state of decay. The script on its open pages so faded it was nearly invisible. "The greatest scholars in the land have looked upon this," Valerius said, his voice devoid of emotion. "They see nothing. They say it is lost forever." Della moved closer, her professional curiosity overriding her fear. She leaned over the book, her gaze sharp and focused. The scholars were right. To a normal eye, the vellum was a meaningless canvas of smudges and water stains. But Della saw more. She didn't just look at the page. She looked into it. She saw the microscopic furrows carved by the pressure of a long-dead hand. She saw the faint chemical ghosting left by iron gall ink as it ate into the fabric of the page over untold centuries. She could feel the story there, hiding just beneath the surface of visibility. Without thinking, she reached out and gently traced a line with her fingertip, a line no one else could see. "It's not gone," she whispered, more to the book than to the man. "It's just sleeping." A profound silence descended upon the room. The candles guttered, their flames shrinking to tiny blue points. The cold intensified. Della looked up and found Valerius staring at her. his expression one she could not decipher. It was a look of stark, utter astonishment, as if a stone had just spoken to him. "You see it," he stated. It wasn't a question. It was a realization that shook the foundations of the ancient room. "I see the impression," she clarified, her voice still soft. "The memory of the words. With the right light, the right tools, I can bring them back." He moved then, covering the distance between them with an unnatural speed that didn't seem to involve walking. One moment he was by the fire, the next he was beside her, his presence a column of absolute cold. She could feel the chill radiating from him, sinking into her skin. He looked down at the book, then at her face. "You will stay," he said. "You will work here. You will not leave until it is done." And just like that, Della's world, once small and safe, was gone. She was a prisoner in a castle of shadows, tasked with waking the secrets of a book for a man who was more than a man. A man who, for the first time in her life, saw the true value of her sight. The days that followed blurred into a strange routine of cold silence and intense focus. Della was given a suite of rooms in a wing of the manor that was less oppressive than the rest. The fires were always lit, though they seemed to give off little heat. Meals appeared outside her door on silver trays, untouched by any servant she ever saw. Her only human contact was Valerius. He would appear in the library without a sound. She would be hunched over the ancient codex, a complex array of lenses and mirrors positioned to cast glancing light across the page, and she would simply feel a drop in temperature, a shift in the quality of the shadows, and know he was there. He never spoke while she worked. He would stand for hours by the hearth, or sit in a high-backed chair in the darkest corner of the room, utterly motionless, watching her. His stillness was unnerving. It was the stillness of a predator, yes, but also of something infinitely patient, like a mountain waiting to be worn down by the wind. Her work was slow, painstaking. She used a dry stylus to trace the ghostly impressions, making a perfect copy on fresh parchment. Then, she would begin the delicate process of re-inking the original, using pigments she had to create herself, matching the faded chemical signature of the ancient ink. It was the most challenging restoration of her life. One evening, deep into the second week, she let out a small gasp of frustration. A particular passage was stubbornly refusing to reveal itself. The vellum was scarred, the impressions muddled. "What is it?" His voice from the shadows made her jump. "This section," she said, pointing. "The script changes. It's more aggressive. The quill was driven harder here, and the language, it feels different." He was beside her in an instant. He leaned over the book, his proximity a shock of cold. She could smell the scent of winter air and old stone that clung to him. He looked at the page, and for a moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes. A deep, ancient pain. "It is a binding," he said, his voice tight. "A curse, woven into the history of my line." Della looked from the book to his face. The pieces were starting to click into place. The unnatural cold, the living shadows, his inhuman stillness, the reverence with which he treated this book. It wasn't just a history. It was an anchor. "This book," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "It holds you." He didn't confirm it with words. He didn't need to. He simply raised a hand, and the heavy velvet curtain over a nearby window billowed and writhed as if in a gale. though the air in the room was perfectly still. The shadows around his feet deepened, coiling like serpents. "The binding fades," he said, his voice low and raw. "A rival house, ancient enemies, have found a way to unravel it from a distance. As the words vanish, so does my strength, my control. You are not just restoring a book, Della. You are restoring me." The truth of it settled over her, heavy as a shroud. The fear was there, a cold, hard stone in her gut. She was in the lair of a creature from forgotten nightmares, a vampire. She should have been terrified. She should have run screaming. But as she looked at him, at the vulnerability he had just exposed, she felt something else rise to meet the fear: compassion. She saw past the power and the danger. She saw a being trapped by his own legacy, fighting a slow, silent war against oblivion. And he had chosen her, the grubby ink witch, the woman everyone else had dismissed, as his only hope. "Why me?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "The world is full of scholars." "They have eyes," Valerius said, his gaze intense, pinning her in place. "But they do not see. You do. You saw the memory on the page. You see the truth of things." He paused, and his next words seemed to be pulled from a place of great depth. "You are the first in centuries to look at me and not see a monster or a title. You see a man with a damaged book." He was right. And in that moment, Della made a choice. She would not be his prisoner. She would be his ally. This was more than a commission. It was a chance to prove what her sight was worth. It was a chance to mend something far more important than paper and ink. She looked him directly in the eye, the crimson flecks swirling in their gray depths. "Then we had better get back to work." Would you have stayed, knowing what he was? Tell me in the comments. And if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. The dynamic in the library shifted after his confession. The silence was still there, but it was different. It was no longer the silence of a master and a servant, or a captor and a prisoner. It became a shared silence, a space of mutual concentration. Della worked with a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just a restorer. She was a bulwark against a coming darkness. Every letter she brought back from the brink felt like a victory. And he was no longer just a spectator. He became a participant. He knew the ancient dialect of the text, a language long dead to the world. When she would uncover a word, she would say it aloud, her pronunciation clumsy. He would correct her, his voice a low murmur, explaining the word's context, its hidden meanings, its power. He began to tell her the stories behind the text. He spoke of his ancestors, of battles fought in forgotten kingdoms, of love and betrayal that played out over centuries. He spoke of his own long life, not as a boast, but as a heavy, weary catalogue of loss. He described watching mountains erode, and forests grow, and cities rise and fall. Della listened, her hands never ceasing their delicate work. She learned that his coldness was not a lack of feeling, but a shield built over millennia to protect a heart that had been broken too many times. He had loved and lost so many mortals that he had sealed himself away in ice to stop the pain. She found herself asking questions no one else would have dared. "Were you ever lonely?" she asked one night as she mixed a new batch of ink. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, from the shadows, his voice came, softer than she had ever heard it. "Loneliness is the price of eternity. It is a sea. You can either drown in it or learn to breathe water." In these quiet moments, the vast, cold manor began to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. The chill from his presence became familiar, almost comforting. She learned to read the subtle shifts in it. When he was agitated, the cold sharpened, pricking at the skin. When he was contemplative, it was a still, deep cold, like a frozen lake. She began to see the man beneath the monster, the weary soul beneath the powerful lord, and she realized, with a startling jolt, that he was doing the same for her. He started to notice things. He saw the faint tremor in her hand after hours of work and would order her to rest. A soft cashmere shawl appeared draped over her chair one evening when she shivered. He had the kitchens prepare her favorite foods, simple things from her old life. Hot bread, stewed apples, dishes he could only have known about if he had been paying impossibly close attention. One night, her hand seized up, a painful cramp locking her fingers. She cried out, dropping her fine-tipped brush. Before she could even react, he was there. He knelt beside her chair and, without a word, took her cramped hand in his. The shock of his touch was electric. His skin was as cold as marble, a profound, deep chill that seemed to go right to her bones. But there was no menace in it. His grip was exquisitely gentle. His long, pale fingers began to work at the knots in her palm and wrist, his touch sure and surprisingly knowing. "You push yourself too hard," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look at her face, his entire focus on her hand. Della couldn't speak. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. This was the most intimate touch she had ever known. The cold of his skin was a strange counterpoint to the heat building inside her. She watched his dark head bent over her hand, the intense concentration on his face. He was mending her, just as she was mending him. When the cramp finally eased, he didn't let go immediately. He turned her hand over and traced the ink stains on her fingertips with his thumb, a feather-light touch that sent shivers up her arm. "These marks," he said softly, his gray eyes lifting to meet hers. "House Thorne called them grubby. I see them as marks of honor. They are the signs of a creator, of a woman who can make the dead speak." Tears pricked at Della's eyes. The old wound, the one left by that cruel laughter, began to ache, but this time it was the ache of a wound that was finally beginning to heal. He saw her. He saw her craft, her value, her worth. He saw it all, and he honored it. He released her hand slowly, and the warmth of the air felt strange and empty where his cold fingers had been. The moment stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. The library, which had once felt so vast and intimidating, now felt as small and intimate as her old workshop. The work on the codex was nearing its end. Della had restored almost the entire text, her copy a perfect mirror of the original. She had deciphered the curse. It was a subtle, insidious thing, a spell of unmaking woven into the very genealogy of his line. It targeted not his physical body, but his connection to the world, to his own history. It was designed to make him fade, to turn him into a ghost, and then into nothing. And the source of the curse, the magical signature she finally managed to isolate, was unmistakable. It bore the crest of House Thorne. "They have been my enemies for 500 years, Valerius explained, his voice flat and cold as a blade. "They practice a cowardly form of blood magic. They cannot face me directly, so they attack my legacy, my anchor." As Della put the finishing touches on the final page, a new energy began to fill the manor. The shadows seemed less listless, more alert. The cold in the air had a new, sharp edge to it. Valerius himself seemed to be gathering, consolidating his power. The fading had been halted. But the Thorns were not fools. They would feel the shift. They would know their curse had been thwarted, and they would look for the cause. Valerius knew they would come for Della. She was his perceived weakness, the mortal element in his immortal world. One evening, he entered the library not in his usual silent way, but with a firm, deliberate step. He was dressed not in his simple black attire, but in formal court dress, a coat of midnight velvet embroidered with silver thread. "There is to be a ball," he announced. "Here, at Blackwood. I am re-entering society." Della stared at him. "A ball? Why?" "To protect you," he said simply. "They will try to harm you to get to me. They see you as a commoner, a tool I am using. They think you are disposable. I will show them that you are not." He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "I will announce our betrothal." Della's breath caught in her throat. "A betrothal, but that's a lie." "Is it?" he asked, his voice quiet. He didn't move closer, but the intensity of his focus made it feel as though he were holding her. "You have restored my past and secured my future. You have looked into the darkest parts of my existence and did not flinch. You have shared my silence and eased my solitude. In what way would naming you my bride be a lie?" Her heart was a wild bird in her chest. This was beyond anything she could have imagined. To be tied to him, to this ancient, powerful, and strangely gentle being. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. "They will hate me," she whispered. "The other houses, they will see me as an upstart." "Let them," he said, a dangerous smile touching his lips for the first time. It transformed his face, making him look both younger and infinitely more lethal. "Their hatred is a dull and rusty thing. It cannot touch you, not when you stand with me." He was offering her more than protection. He was offering her a place, a name, a shield forged of his own immense power. And in return, he was asking her to step out of the shadows and into the light of his dangerous world. Looking at him, at the silent promise in his eyes, Della knew there was only one answer she could give. The night of the ball arrived like a storm. Carriages crunched on the gravel drive, spilling forth the nobility of the realm, their jewels and silks a garish splash of color against the stark black stone of Blackwood Manor. They came out of curiosity and fear, eager to see the reclusive Lord Valerius, the man they called the Vampire King in hushed whispers, and the mysterious commoner he was said to favor. The great hall, usually so cold and silent, was ablaze with thousands of candles. Their light flickered and danced, but it could not dispel the deep-seated chill of the place, nor the way the shadows in the high-vaulted ceiling seemed to watch the guests with a predatory intelligence. Della stood beside Valerius at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting on his arm. He had given her a gown the color of a midnight sky, a simple, elegant cut that needed no jewels to adorn it. His presence beside her was a fortress of cold calm. His hand, resting over hers, was like a granite anchor in a turbulent sea. She could feel the power thrumming just beneath his skin, perfectly controlled, waiting. He introduced her simply. "This is Mistress Della, my honored guest and my intended." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Disbelief, scorn, envy. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, judging her, dissecting her. She saw the faces of House Thorne among the guests, the cruel-mouthed young lord who had humiliated her, and his two cousins. They were watching her with open contempt, their faces flushed with wine and arrogance. The evening wore on, a tense parade of false smiles and veiled insults. Della handled it with a quiet dignity she didn't know she possessed. Valerius never left her side. His attention was solely on her, a public declaration more powerful than any words. He made them all see that to insult her was to insult him. But the hatred of House Thorne was not so easily cowed. They saw his devotion not as a strength, but as a fatal flaw. They saw a chance to humiliate him in a way that would wound him more deeply than any blade. It happened after the supper, when Valerius was called away for a moment to speak with the old duke. The three young lords of House Thorne saw their opportunity. They cornered Della near the dais, their movements a little unsteady from wine, but their eyes sharp with malice. "The little ink witch," the young lord sneered, his voice loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "Playing at being a lady. Do you really think he will marry you? He is using you, a common plaything to be discarded when he is bored." Della stood her ground, her chin held high. "I think you mistake his character, my lord, and my own." Her calm defiance enraged him. His face darkened. "You dare speak back to me? You, a gutter-born nobody?" And then it happened. In a flash of drunken rage and aristocratic entitlement, he and his two cousins drew their ceremonial swords. They were meant for decoration, but they were still steel, still sharp. The crowd gasped, stumbling back. 3 polished blades were leveled at Della's heart. The ballroom fell into that terrible, breathless silence. Time seemed to slow. Della saw the hatred in their eyes, the sneering triumph on their lips. This was it. This was how they would break him, by breaking her first. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had forgotten who he was. There was no sound, no warning, just a blur of black and a rush of impossible cold. Valerius was suddenly there, standing between Della and the blades. He hadn't run. He had simply ceased to be by the Duke and begun to be in front of her. He moved so fast he seemed to tear a hole in the very fabric of reality. The First Lord, the one who had mocked her years ago, didn't have time to stop his lunge. The tip of his sword struck Valerius's outstretched hand. It did not pierce the skin. It was as if he had struck a block of iron. But Valerius allowed it. He closed his fingers around the blade, and with a quiet, deliberate pressure, he let the edge slice into his palm. A single drop of blood, startlingly crimson, welled up. It hung for a moment, a perfect, glistening jewel, before falling with an unnaturally loud splash onto the white marble floor. The silence in the room became absolute. It was no longer a silence of shock, but of pure, primal terror. The temperature in the grand hall plummeted. Frost began to bloom on the window panes. The thousands of candles flickered in unison, their flames turning a sickly blue as the shadows in the room deepened, flowing from the corners to pool around Valerius's feet like a living tide. He raised his head and looked at the 3 lords. His eyes were no longer gray. They were solid, burning crimson, glowing with an ancient, terrifying light. He was not angry. Anger was a human emotion, hot and messy. This was something else, something cold and old and final. "You have made," he said, his voice a low, resonant whisper that filled every corner of the vast hall, carrying the weight of an impending avalanche. "A grave error." Without any visible effort, he tightened his grip. The tempered steel of the sword groaned, bent, and then snapped in his hand. He let the pieces fall to the floor with a clatter that sounded like a death knell. He moved on the other two before they could even think to react. It was not a fight. It was a dismantling. A flick of his wrist sent one sword flying into the stone wall, where it embedded itself to the hilt. A simple, open-handed touch to the chest of the other sent the man flying backward 10 feet, crashing into a table of food and wine. Valerius stood before the First Lord, the leader, who was now unarmed, pale, and trembling. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You wished to humiliate me," Valerius said, his crimson gaze boring into the man's soul. "You think my affection for this woman is a weakness. You are wrong. It is my greatest strength. She has a skill you cannot comprehend, a perception you will never possess, and a courage that would make your entire bloodline tremble." He turned his gaze from the terrified lord and swept it across the assembled nobility, every single one of them held captive by his power. "You see a commoner," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "I see the woman who saved my very soul from fading into nothing. Her hands, which you called grubby, have more honor and worth in them than all the titles and lands in this room combined. She is not my plaything. She is my equal. She is my choice." He turned back to the trembling Lord Thorne. "You will not be harmed tonight. Death is too simple a punishment. Instead, you will live. You will live and watch as your house withers. Your alliances will turn to dust. Your wealth will become ash. You will be remembered for nothing but this single moment of pathetic cowardice. You tried to strike my heart. You failed." He then reached back, not looking at Della, but knowing she was there. He took her hand, his own still bleeding slightly, and pulled her forward to stand beside him. He lifted her hand, the one with the faint ink stains, and pressed his lips to her knuckles in front of everyone, a gesture of fealty, of worship. "This is my bride," the Vampire King announced to the silent, terrified room. "And this is the last time any of you will ever forget it." The power of that night echoed for decades. House Thorne fell, just as he had promised. Their ruin was slow, methodical, and complete. No one would trade with them, ally with them, or even speak their name. They became a cautionary tale whispered in shadowed halls. And Della was transformed. Not by magic, or by an immortal bite, but by the simple, profound power of being seen and valued. The whispers about the ink witch died, replaced by awed murmurs about the seer of Blackwood, the consort of the formidable Lord Valerius, the woman whose sight was sharper than any sword. The old wound in her chest, the one carved by ridicule and scorn, was gone, healed completely. In its place was a quiet, unshakable confidence. She had faced down blades and the contempt of the entire aristocracy, and had not flinched, because she knew the being beside her saw her as his equal. Their betrothal was no longer a political maneuver. It became a true partnership. They were married in a quiet ceremony under a winter moon in the ancient garden behind the manor. Their only witnesses were the silent, watching shadows, which seemed to bow in reverence. Life at Blackwood Manor settled into a new kind of peace. The halls were still cold, the silence still profound, but it was their cold, their silence. It was home. Della continued her work, becoming the foremost expert in ancient texts and magical bindings, her skills sought by scholars and kings, though she never left Valerius's side. He, in turn, began to change. The ice around his heart, built up over 1,000 years, began to thaw under the steady, quiet warmth of her presence. He learned to smile, not the dangerous, sharp smile he had shown his enemies, but a small, genuine curve of his lips reserved only for her. He learned to laugh, a low, rusty sound at first, but one that grew more frequent as the years passed. One evening, a year after the ball, they were sitting in the library, the great codex now resting in a sealed glass case, its script bold and clear. Della was teaching him a game of cards, and he was losing spectacularly, his ancient mind struggling with the simple, modern rules. She laughed as she laid down a winning hand. "You can command shadows and snap steel, but you cannot bluff at cards." He looked at her, his eyes the color of a soft twilight sky, the crimson flecks dormant. "It is a skill I was never required to learn." He reached across the table and took her hand. His skin was still cool, but it no longer felt like a shock. It felt like him. "Della," he said, his voice serious. "There is a matter we have not spoken of." She knew what he meant. Her hair was already showing a few strands of silver. The fine lines around her eyes were deepening. Her life was a fleeting breath compared to his endless night. "I know," she said softly. "The choice is yours," he said, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "Always. I can offer you eternity, to walk beside me through the ages, but I will not force it. I would not trade a single day of your true life for 1,000 years of a life you did not choose. I loved you as a mortal. I will love you as a memory. The choice is yours." Della looked at their joined hands. His, so pale and ageless. Hers, marked by ink and time. She thought of her small, quiet life before him, and the vast, full life she had now. She thought of his loneliness, and the companionship they had built together in the heart of the shadows. She turned his hand over and traced the faint, silvery line of the scar on his palm, where he had taken the blade for her. "You say loneliness is a sea," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "You taught yourself to breathe the water. I would rather you taught me." A slow, wondrous smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the smile of a man who had waited 1,000 years for the sun to rise. He brought her hand to his lips, his cool breath ghosting over her skin. "Then we have all the time in the world," he said. And in the quiet of the ancient library, surrounded by the stories of the ages, they began to plan their own. For more stories where quiet compassion conquers ancient loneliness, and where an overlooked skill becomes a saving grace, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.